a human among the galaxy's most elite warriors. Can he survive? When Elias Korr steps on a Nova Crucible, he isn't just the weakest recruit in an academy of alien titans. He's an error in the system. But when he meets Kaelyra Vonn, a Centaura warrior with liquid silver skin, glowing crimson eyes, and a body sculpted to perfection, he realizes his real challenge isn't just survival. It's proving he belongs. And as the war among the stars begins, the question remains, will he rise or fall? If you love sci-fi stories packed with action, mystery, and steamy intergalactic chemistry, make sure to like and subscribe now. Elias Korr and Kaelyra Vonn's journey is only just beginning. You won't want to miss what happens next. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's explore the universe together. Elias Korr gripped the straps of his worn duffel bag as the transport pod jolted to a stop. A dull thud echoed through the small cabin, and the hatch hissed open, spilling harsh white light into his eyes. He squinted, stepping out onto the sleek metal floor of Nova Crucible's docking bay. The air smelled sharp, metallic, and faintly of ozone, a far cry from the dusty fields of Terra Verge, the backwater planet he'd called home for 23 years. His stomach twisted, a knot of nerves and disbelief. How had he, nobody from a forgotten world, ended up here? The massive orbital station loomed around him, its towering spires and glowing conduits stretching into the void beyond the viewport. Sleek fighters darted through the blackness outside, their engines trailing faint blue streaks against the endless stars. Nova Crucible wasn't just any military academy. It was the academy, a training ground for the galaxy's fiercest warriors, built to stand against the creeping threat of the Shroud. Elias had heard the stories. Towering Draken with scales like armor, ethereals shimmering with raw energy, and the Centaura, machine-born soldiers whose bodies defied nature. And now, somehow, him, a human, the weakest link in a chain of titans. He shifted his bag on his shoulder, boots clanging against the floor as he followed the holographic signs toward the reception hall. A mistake, he told himself. It had to be. The acceptance message had popped up on his cracked personal device 3 weeks ago, flickering with the Academy's insignia. Elias Korr, Terra Verge. Admission granted. No explanation, no interview. Just a summons he couldn't ignore. His mother's voice rang in his head, rough but proud. Corpsmen don't run from a fight, even if it's a dumb one. So here he was, chasing a glitch in the system, hoping it wasn't a cruel joke. The reception hall buzzed with life when he stepped inside. Alien faces turned toward him, their stares sharp and curious. A Draken cadet towered nearby, his crimson scales glinting under the lights, claws tapping impatiently against his armor. An ethereal floated past, its form a swirl of glowing mist that left a faint hum in the air. Elias scanned the crowd. No humans, not one. His chest tightened. He was a speck of dust in a storm of giants. A holographic figure flickered to life in front of him, its voice flat and mechanical. Species, human. Name, Elias Korr. Proceed to orientation chamber C4. The AI paused, its glowing eyes narrowing as if puzzled. Unexpected admission. Processing. Then it vanished, leaving Elias blinking at empty air. Great start. He shuffled toward the chamber, weaving through the crowd. A massive Centaura brushed past him, its body a shifting mass of liquid metal that gleamed like polished silver. Elias stumbled, nearly dropping his bag, and muttered an apology. The alien didn't even glance back, its 4 arms flexing as it joined a group of equally imposing cadets. They shot him a look, cold, dismissive, and Elias felt his face heat up. He squared his shoulders, pretending not to notice, but the weight of their judgment pressed down like a physical thing. Orientation Chamber C4 was a wide, circular room with walls that pulsed faintly with blue light. About 40 cadets stood in loose groups, their voices a mix of growls, clicks, and hums filtered through universal translators. The chatter died as Elias stepped inside. Every eye, or whatever passed for eyes, locked onto him. A human, someone muttered, the words sharp in his earpiece. Must be lost, another voice snickered, followed by a ripple of low laughter. Elias clenched his jaw and found a spot near the back, his bag thudding to the floor beside him. He'd expected this. Humans were the galaxy's underdogs. No claws, no energy fields, no fancy tech built into their bones. Back home, his father had been a cargo hauler, scraping by on runs between dying colonies. "We're tough where it counts," the old man used to say, tapping his chest. Elias wasn't so sure. Tough didn't mean much when you were surrounded by walking weapons. A flash of silver caught his eye, pulling him out of his thoughts. At the front of the room stood a figure that made his breath hitch. She was Centaura, no doubt about it, but nothing like the hulking one he'd bumped into earlier. Her body shimmered with liquid metal, sculpted into a form so striking it bordered on unfair. Her chest swelled against the tight, dark armor she wore, full and bold, drawing the eye like a magnet. Her waist cinched tight, flaring out into hips that curved wide and smooth, leading to a backside so round and firm it seemed to defy the laws of physics. Each step she took sent a subtle ripple through her frame, a dance of power and grace that made the other cadets look clumsy by comparison. Long black hair flowed down her back, catching the light, and her eyes, crimson, sharp, and glowing, swept the room with quiet authority. "Who's that?" Elias whispered to a nearby cadet, a wiry ethereal with a flickering form. The alien's voice buzzed softly. "Kaelyra Vonn, Centaura Elite, top of her cohort. Don't bother. She's out of everyone's league, especially yours, human." Elias swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He hadn't been planning anything, but the way she moved, the way her armor hugged every curve, it was hard not to stare. The orientation kicked off with a stern Draken commander barking orders, his scales rattling as he outlined the day's trials. Flight sims, combat drills, energy grid tests. Elias barely heard him, his eyes drifting back to Kaelyra. She stood tall, arms crossed under her chest, pushing it up even more. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He was here to survive, not gawk. The first test was in the flight simulator hangar. Elias climbed into a pod, his hands sweaty on the controls. He'd flown his dad's rickety cargo skiff 100 times, but this was different, sleek, alien, and way too fast. The neural link snapped into place, flooding his head with data he couldn't process. His ship spun wildly on the screen, crashing into a virtual asteroid in seconds. Laughter erupted from the other pods, sharp and mocking. "Nice flying, human," a voice crackled through the comms. Elias gritted his teeth, his face burning. When the session ended, he stumbled out, legs shaky. Kaelyra emerged from her pod last, her hair slightly mussed from the helmet, but her expression cool and unbothered. She'd aced it, of course. Her ship had danced through the sim like it was alive. Elias caught her eye as she passed, summoning a scrap of courage. "Good run," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. She stopped, turning those crimson eyes on him. Up close, he saw faint patterns in her silver skin, like circuits etched in light. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile, more a smirk, cold and cutting. "You're here by mistake," she said, her voice low and smooth, wrapping around him like a tease he couldn't shake. "Go home before you break something, or yourself." She stepped closer, just enough for him to feel the heat radiating from her, her chest brushing his arm for a fleeting second. His breath hitched, and before he could respond, she walked away, hips swaying with every step. Elias stood there, rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. He didn't know if he wanted to prove her wrong or chase after her, or both. But one thing was clear. Nova Crucible wasn't going to let him slide by unnoticed, and neither was Kaelyra Vonn. Elias Thorne wasn't sure how he'd ended up here, stuck in a dimly lit lab on Zarathra, the air humming with alien tech, under the watchful eye of Kaelyra Vethra. The grid node incident had been a disaster. He'd been tweaking the Ravensclaw's power core, trying to boost its output after a rough jump, when the damn thing overloaded, sparks flying, alarms blaring, and a pulse of energy that nearly fried the ship's systems. Kale had cursed him out for it, but Kaelyra? She just stared, those red eyes narrowing like she was dissecting him, and hauled him off to her lap. "You're a liability," she'd said, voice smooth as steel. "I'm keeping you under observation." Now, here he was, perched on a stool in her workspace, surrounded by glowing panels and biotubes pulsing with green fluid. The lab smelled sharp, metal and something sweet, like Zarathr's air always did, but it was thicker here, clinging to his lungs. Elias rubbed his hands on his patched-up pants, the sweat on his palms more from nerves than the heat. Kaelyra moved around him, her silver skin catching the light, her bio-armor shifting with every step like it was part of her. She was all business, tapping at a holographic screen, her black hair spilling over one shoulder in a slick wave. "Don't touch anything," she warned, not looking up. "You've done enough damage." Elias smirked, leaning back. "Yeah, well, I fixed it, didn't I? Ship's still flying." She shot him a look, sharp, red, and way too intense. And he shut up, feeling like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. The lab's hum grew louder, the walls flexing faintly, and he couldn't shake the sense she was testing him, waiting for him to screw up again. "What's the deal, anyway?" he asked, crossing his arms. "You're going to babysit me all day?" Kaelyra didn't answer, just kept working, but he caught the faintest twitch at the corner of her lips, like she was amused or annoyed or both. The lab shrank as the hours dragged on, the air getting heavier, stickier, until Elias felt it pressing on his chest. He'd been fiddling with a diagnostic tool, a sleek, glowing rod Kaelyra had tossed him to keep him busy, when she moved to his side, reaching for a scanner on the table. Their shoulders brushed, and Elias froze, suddenly hyper-aware of her. She was close, too close, her bio-armor glinting inches from his face, the faint hum of it buzzing in his ears. "Move," she said, voice low, but he couldn't. Instead, his hand slipped, reaching past her for the tool he dropped. His fingers grazed her waist, sliding along the smooth curve where her armor dipped, tracing the silky edge of her form. It was like touching warm satin over steel, soft, firm, alive, and his breath hitched, heat shooting up his arm like a live wire. Kaelyra stiffened, her chest rising sharply under the tight biosuit, the faint outline of her curves catching the light. Her red eyes snapped to his, glowing fierce and dangerous. "What do you think you're doing, human?" she asked, her tone a mix of warning and something else, something that made his pulse jump. Elias flushed, his face burning as the warmth from her skin spread through him, tingling down his spine. Sorry, just grabbing this," he stammered, holding up the rod like it was proof. But he didn't pull back, and neither did she. Kaelyra stepped closer, deliberate, her hips brushing his as she loomed over him. Her breath ghosted across his shoulder, hot and steady, stirring the hair at his neck. "Careful," she murmured, her voice dropping lower. "You're playing with things you don't understand." Her gaze locked on his, daring him to move, to react, and Elias felt like he was drowning in it, caught between panic and a pull he couldn't name. She didn't back off. Instead, she leaned in, her chest grazing his arm as she reached past him to adjust the scanner. It was quick, subtle, but he felt it, the press of her, firm and warm, sending a jolt through him that he couldn't shake. His throat went dry, his mind scrambling. "She's messing with me," he thought, swallowing hard. "Gotta be." But the way her lips curved, just a flicker, said she knew exactly what she was doing. Kaelyra pulled back after a beat, her red eyes lingering on Elias like she was seeing him for the first time. "You're not like the others," she said, almost to herself, her tone shifting, less cold, more curious. She turned to the screen, but her movements slowed, deliberate, and Elias caught it, a change small but real. She tilted her head, letting her hair slide across her shoulder, and stepped closer again, this time to check the hollow display over his shoulder. Her chest brushed his back, light but intentional, and he tensed, every nerve firing. She's doing it on purpose, he realized, his heart thudding. But why? He'd been a screw-up, nearly blew the ship, got dragged here like a kid in timeout. And yet here she was testing him, poking at him like he was some puzzle she wanted to solve. "What's your game, princess?" he asked, voice rough, turning to face her. She didn't flinch, just met his stare, her lips parting slightly. "You're still here," she said, simple but loaded. Most would have run. Elias smirked, leaning into it. "Yeah, well, I'm stubborn. And you're not exactly boring." Her eyes flickered, a spark of something. Amusement, maybe, or interest, and she stayed close, her breath warm on his cheek. "Tell me," she said, softer now, "why do you keep pushing?" He shrugged, honest for once. "Guess I like the rush. And you're worth figuring out." Kaelyra's gaze softened, just a fraction, and Elias knew it. She was curious too, drawn to whatever this was growing between them. The lab hummed on, but the air felt different now, charged, thick with unspoken things. Kaelyra didn't pull away, her curiosity peeling back the steel she usually wore. She reached for the screen again, her arm brushing his deliberately, and Elias didn't dodge it this time. "Your trouble," she muttered, but her tone was almost playful, her red eyes glinting as she studied him. He grinned, leaning closer. "Takes one to know one." She didn't argue, just stood there, letting the moment stretch, her presence pulling him in like gravity. Elias felt it, a shift, a crack in her walls, and he wasn't about to let it slip. "Guess we're stuck figuring each other out," he said, voice low. Kaelyra's lips twitched, and she nodded, faint but real. "Maybe," she replied, and that was enough for now. Elias Korr tightened his grip on the co-pilot controls of the sleek scout vessel, his knuckles whitening against the smooth metal. The ship hummed around him, its prototype systems pulsing with a faint blue glow that bathed the cramped cockpit in an eerie light. Outside the narrow viewport, the void stretched endlessly, black, cold, and unforgiving, until it wasn't. Ahead loomed the artificial black hole, a swirling maw of darkness ringed with jagged light, its gravitational pull tugging at the vessel like an invisible hand. His stomach churned, a mix of fear and adrenaline. This wasn't a simulator. This was real. Beside him, Kaelyra Vonn sat in the pilot's seat, her silver hands dancing across the controls with a precision that made Elias's clumsy attempts look laughable. Her body shimmered under the tight armor, every curve a distraction he fought to ignore, her chest full and bold, her hips flaring into a shape that seemed carved from liquid starlight. Her crimson eyes flicked to the readouts, sharp and focused, while her long black hair swayed slightly with each movement. She hadn't spoken much since they'd launched from Nova Crucible an hour ago, her silence a wall between them. Elias didn't mind. He was still trying to figure out how he'd ended up paired with her for this mission. "Approaching entry vector," she said, her voice low and smooth, cutting through the hum of the ship. "Standard protocol is to skirt the outer rim. Less risk." Elias glanced at the NAV screen, his brow furrowing. The swirling vortex filled the display, its edges crackling with energy. "That'll take too long," he muttered, almost to himself. "There's a gap, right there." He pointed at a narrow break in the gravitational field, a sliver of space where the pull seemed weaker. "We could cut through. Save 20 minutes. Kaelyra's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "That's reckless. No one's charted that path. You'd need reflexes beyond human limits to thread it." Her tone dripped with skepticism, the same cold edge she'd used when she'd told him to go home days ago. "Maybe," Elias said, meeting her gaze. His pulse quickened, not just from the challenge, but from the way her lips parted slightly, revealing a flicker of curiosity beneath her disdain. "Or maybe I've got something you don't expect. Let me try." For a moment, she said nothing, her eyes locked on his. Then, with a faint huff, she adjusted the controls. "Fine, take the helm. Prove me wrong, or kill us both." She slid her hands off the panel, leaning back in her seat, arms crossing under her chest in a way that made it impossible not to notice how the armor hugged her curves. Elias swallowed hard and shifted to the pilot station, the neural interface clicking into place against his temples. The Grid Nexus tech, ancient, unpredictable, flooded his mind with a rush of data, sharper and deeper than anything he'd felt in The Sims. His vision blurred for a second, then snapped into focus. Faint, glowing lines flickered into existence, threading through the blackness ahead. Paths, possibilities, trajectories only he could see. His breath steadied. He could do this. The ship surged forward as he guided it toward the gap. The black holes pulled clawing at the hull. Alarms blared, red lights flashing across the console, but Elias tuned them out. The glowing lines danced in his head, guiding his hands as he twisted the controls. The vessel darted left, then right, weaving between invisible currents of gravity that threatened to crush them. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his muscles straining with every move. Beside him, Kaelyra sat silent, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the viewport. They were halfway through when it happened. A sudden ripple in the field, a gravitational spike the sensors hadn't caught, yanked the ship off course. Elias cursed under his breath, jerking the controls hard. The hull groaned, metal creaking as the black hole's edge loomed closer. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice tight. Kaelyra gripped her seat, her silver fingers digging into the armrests. "You're going to tear us apart," she snapped, but there was no time to argue. The glowing lines shifted in Elias's mind, showing a new path, a desperate one. He didn't think. He acted. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the ship into a spiraling dive, threading it through a tunnel of warped space so narrow he could feel the walls brushing the hull. The cockpit shook violently, warning lights bathing them in crimson. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, his focus absolute. The lines burned bright, guiding him like a lifeline. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, with a final lurch, the ship burst free, tumbling into open space beyond the black hole's grasp. Silence fell, heavy and sudden. Elias slumped back in his seat, his breath ragged, sweat dripping down his neck. The glowing lines faded from his vision, leaving a dull ache behind his eyes. He'd done it. They were alive. Kaelyra unbuckled her restraints, her movements sharp and quick. "Status," she demanded, her voice clipped as she checked the console. Her fingers flew over the controls, the faint hum of her metallic skin filling the quiet. "Engines at 60%, Elias said, his throat dry. "Navigation shaky, but we're clear. No major damage." He turned to her, expecting a nod, maybe a grudging thanks. Instead, she stood and strode to the rear of the cockpit, her hips swaying with that effortless grace that drove him crazy. "We need to land," she said, not looking back. "There's a cavern on that asteroid, K-19. Emergency protocols." Now, Elias didn't argue. He guided the ship toward the jagged rock floating ahead, its surface pocked with craters. The landing was rough, the damaged thrusters sputtering as they touched down in a shallow cave. Dust swirled outside the viewport, settling slowly in the low gravity. The cockpit lights dimmed to a soft amber, casting long shadows across the walls. Kaelyra was already moving, her armor clinking faintly as she climbed out of her seat. Elias followed, his legs unsteady from the adrenaline crash. The air in the cave was thin but breathable, tinged with a stale, metallic scent. He stepped closer to help her, but she stumbled slightly, one hand bracing against the hull. Her breathing was off, quick, uneven. "You okay?" he asked, reaching out instinctively. His hand caught her arm, steadying her, and she didn't pull away. Up close, he could feel the heat radiating from her, her silver skin warm even through the armor. She turned to face him, her crimson eyes locking onto his, and for once, there was no mockery in them, just something raw, unguarded. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was softer now, almost a whisper. She straightened, stepping out of the pilot's chair fully, and Elias moved to help her down. His hands slid to her sides, brushing the curve of her waist, and he froze as his fingers grazed the edge of her thigh. Her skin, liquid metal, smooth as velvet, felt alive under his touch, hot and pulsing faintly. A shiver ran through him, his pulse racing again, but for a different reason now. Kaelyra's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling faster, pushing against the tight armor in a way that made Elias's mouth go dry. She didn't move, didn't push him away. Instead, she tilted her head, those glowing eyes searching his face. "You really surprised me back there," she said, her tone low and husky, like a secret she hadn't meant to share. No human should have pulled that off. Elias's hands lingered on her hips, feeling the smooth, firm lines of her body through the thin layer of armor. His thumbs brushed the dip just above her waist, and she tensed, a faint tremble running through her. "Guess I'm full of surprises," he managed, his voice rougher than he intended. He couldn't look away from her. Those eyes, that body, the way she stood so close he could feel her warmth seeping into him. The cave around them felt smaller, the amber light softening the edges of her silver form. Kaelyra stepped closer, her chest brushing his for a fleeting second, sending a jolt through his core. Her lips parted, and he thought she might say something sharp, something to break the moment, but she didn't. Instead, her hand lifted, hovering near his shoulder, then settling there lightly. Her touch was cool at first, then warm, like metal soaking in his heat. "You're not what I expected," she murmured, her gaze dropping to his mouth, then back to his eyes. The air between them thickened, heavy with something unspoken, something electric. Elias's fingers tightened on her hips, tracing the curve down to her thighs again, and she let out a soft sound, half gasp, half sigh, that sent fire racing through his veins. For a heartbeat, they stood there, locked in the tension, the world beyond the cave forgotten. His hands slid up her sides, brushing the edge of her ribs, and her chest pressed closer, full and unyielding against him. The heat of her, the softness beneath the strength, it was dizzying, overwhelming. He wanted to pull her in, to feel more, but something held him back, a flicker of doubt, a whisper that she'd push him away. Kaelyra's eyes darkened, the crimson glow deepening. "Don't think this changes anything," she said, but her voice wavered, betraying her. She stepped back, breaking the contact, and the sudden absence of her warmth left Elias reeling. She turned toward the console, her movements stiff, like she was fighting herself as much as him. Elias exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. His skin still burned where he'd touched her, his mind replaying the feel of her curves, the sound of that gasp. She was right. It didn't change anything. Not yet. But the way she'd looked at him, the way she hadn't pulled away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something neither of them could ignore. "Check the distress beacon," she said, her tone brisk again, but softer around the edges. "We're stuck here until help arrives." Elias nodded, moving to the controls, but his thoughts stayed on her, on the heat of her skin, the tremble in her voice. He'd save her life today, and maybe, just maybe, he cracked the wall she'd built between them. As the beacon's signal pulsed into the void, he stole a glance at her, her silver form glowing faintly in the dim light. She wasn't his yet, not even close, but for the first time, he dared to hope she might be worth a fight. Elias Korr wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands trembling as he steadied the controls of the battered scout vessel. The ship lurched, its engines coughing out a weak sputter before settling into an uneven hum. Outside the cracked viewport, the asteroid field stretched endlessly, a graveyard of jagged rocks floating in the dark, their edges glinting faintly under the distant starlight. He'd pushed the grid nexus tech to its limit, getting them out of that black hole, but it hadn't been enough to avoid the ambush. The Seekers had come out of nowhere, their sleek, modified ships firing energy bursts that shredded the vessel's stabilizers. Elias had barely managed to dodge the worst of it, crash-landing them here, on a forgotten chunk of space debris. Beside him, Kaelyra Vonn unbuckled her restraints with a sharp click, her silver hands moving fast despite the faint tremor in them. Her armor gleamed in the dim cockpit light, hugging her body like a second skin, her chest full and proud, her hips flaring into curves that seemed to pull Elias's eyes no matter how hard he tried to focus. Her crimson gaze darted to the console, scanning the flickering readouts. "Engines are shot," she said, her voice tight but steady. "Life support's holding, for now. We're stuck until rescue picks up the beacon." Elias nodded, his throat dry. "How long?" "Hours, maybe more," she replied, standing up with that fluid grace that always caught him off guard. Her long black hair swayed as she moved to the hatch, her backside swaying subtly with each step, a sight that made his pulse jump despite the situation. This isn't just an asteroid. It's an old station, pre-Federation. There's a chance it's got power, maybe supplies. We need to check. He didn't argue. The ship was a sitting target, and staying put felt like waiting to die. Elias grabbed his gear, a pulse rifle and a handheld scanner, and followed her out. The hatch groaned open, spilling them into a cavernous chamber of rusted metal and shadows. The air was stale, heavy with dust and the faint tang of decay, but breathable. Dim emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting a soft orange glow over the abandoned space. Crates and broken machinery littered the floor, relics of a time long gone. Kaelyra took the lead, her boots clanging softly against the metal deck. Elias stayed close, his eyes tracing the lines of her form as she moved, her waist cinching tight, her hips rolling with every stride. He shook his head, forcing his focus back to the scanner. Picking up a power signature, he said, his voice echoing faintly. 50 meters ahead. Could be a generator. She glanced back, her crimson eyes catching the light. Good. Keep up, human. I'm not carrying you if you lag. Her tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of something softer in it, something he'd heard back in the cave after the black hole. Elias smirked despite himself. Maybe she didn't hate him as much as she let on. They pushed deeper into the station, weaving through narrow corridors lined with cracked panels and dangling wires. The air grew warmer, a faint hum vibrating through the walls. Elias's scanner beeped louder as they neared a wide, circular chamber. In the center stood a rusted generator, its core still glowing faintly with residual energy. Kaelyra knelt beside it, her fingers brushing the controls with a precision that made Elias jealous. It's old, she muttered, but it might hold. I can boost the beacon signal from here. Elias set his rifle down and crouched beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. She didn't pull away, and the heat from her silver skin seeped through his sleeve, sending a shiver down his spine. Need a hand? He asked, keeping his voice casual despite the way his heart thudded. She shot him a sidelong glance, her lips twitching. Don't break anything. But she slid over slightly, letting him work the secondary panel. Their hands moved in sync, adjusting wires and flipping switches, the faint buzz of the generator growing steadier. For a moment, they were a team. No snark, no tension, just two people trying to survive. The beacon flared to life, its signal pulsing strong and steady. Kaelyra leaned back, exhaling softly. That's it. Now we wait. She stood, stretching her arms overhead, and Elias couldn't help but stare. Her armor shifted with emotion, outlining her chest in a way that made his mouth go dry, her hips tilting as she rolled her shoulders. She caught him looking and raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything, just turned and walked to a nearby crate, sitting on it with a casual grace that felt like a challenge. Elias stayed where he was, his hands resting on his knees. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, the hum of the generator the only sound. He glanced at her, at the way the orange light played across her silver skin, highlighting every curve. You're quiet, he said finally, testing the waters. Not going to tell me to go home again? Kaelyra's eyes flicked to him, glowing faintly in the dimness. You'd ignore me if I did, she said, her voice low and smooth, wrapping around him like a thread he couldn't pull free from. You're stubborn. Reckless, too. But, she paused, her gaze softening for a split second. You've got guts. I'll give you that. He grinned, leaning back against the generator. Coming from you. That's high praise. His eyes drifted to her again, lingering on the way her legs crossed, the armor clinging to her thighs. She shifted, uncrossing them, and the motion sent a jolt through him. He looked away, heat creeping up his neck, but her soft laugh pulled him back. You're not subtle, human, she said, sliding off the crate and stepping closer. Her boots clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, her hips swaying just enough to make his breath catch. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her, her scent, a mix of metal and something faintly sweet, filling his senses. Elias stood, drawn up by some instinct he couldn't name, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Didn't think I needed to be," he said, his voice rougher now. She tilted her head, her crimson eyes searching his face, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached for the clasps on her outer armor. The plates loosened with a soft hiss, sliding away to reveal the liquid metal of her true form, shimmering like molten silver under the faint light. His breath stopped. Her body was a vision, her chest full and round, glinting like polished crystal, her waist dipping into a curve that flowed into hips so wide and smooth they seemed unreal. Her backside arched out, firm and inviting, every line of her screaming power and allure. Elias's hands clenched at his sides, his mind racing. She was unreal, impossible, and yet here she was, standing inches away, watching him with those glowing eyes. Kaelyra stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What do you want from me, Elias?" The words trembled, laced with a hunger she couldn't hide, and it snapped something inside him. He moved before he could think, closing the gap, his hands finding her waist. His fingers sank into her skin, hot, soft, like velvet over steel, and a low groan escaped him as he felt the heat of her against his palms. She didn't pull back. Her breath hitched, her chest rising fast, pushing against him as he slid his hands up her sides, tracing the dip of her ribs. "This," he murmured, his lips brushing the curve of her neck, tasting the faint warmth of her silver skin. She shivered under his touch, a soft sound, half moan, half sigh, slipping from her lips. His hands moved lower, one sliding to her hip, the other brushing the inside of her thigh, the softness there driving him wild. Kaelyra's hands gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging in as she pressed herself closer, her chest full and firm against his. "Your trouble," she whispered, her voice shaking with need, her eyes dark and molten. Elias pulled her tighter, his lips trailing along her jaw, his hand cupping her hip, feeling the smooth arch of her backside. She arched into him, her body trembling, and they sank to the floor together, the cold metal beneath them a sharp contrast to the fire between them. The air grew thick, their breaths mingling in the dimness, a tangle of heat and want. Elias's hands roamed her back, her thighs, every touch sending sparks through him. She clung to him, her silver form glowing faintly, her gasps filling the silence. The world shrank to just them, her warmth, her softness, the way she fit against him like she'd been made for it. But even as the tension built, threatening to spill over, they held back, teetering on the edge of something deeper, something unspoken. Finally, Kaelyra pulled away slightly, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on his. "This doesn't mean I trust you," she said, but her voice was soft, unguarded, and her hand lingered on his arm, warm and steady. Elias nodded, his own breath ragged, his skin still burning where she'd touched him. "I'll take what I can get," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She laughed, a real laugh, low and rich, and stood, offering him a hand. He took it, letting her pull him up, and for the first time he felt it, a bond, fragile but real, forged in the shadows of this broken place. The beacon's hum filled the quiet, a reminder of the world outside. Kaelyra moved to check it, her movements smoother now, less guarded. Elias watched her go, his mind still reeling from the feel of her, the taste of her closeness. She wasn't his, not fully, not yet, but she was with him now, an ally in a fight he hadn't chosen. And as the station's lights flickered around them, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Elias Korr stood in the heart of Nova Crucible's central archive, his boots planted firm against the cold metal floor. The chamber hummed with energy, its towering walls lined with glowing containment fields, each holding fragments of ancient tech, relics of the grid nexus, pulsing faintly like stars trapped in glass. His pulse raced, a wild drumbeat in his chest, as the air thickened with the weight of what was coming. The Seekers had breached the Academy's outer defenses, their ships cloaked in stolen tech, and now they were here, inside, chasing the one thing that could unleash the Shroud. A darkness older than the stars, a force that devoured light and left nothing behind. Beside him, Kaelyra Vonn checked her pulse rifle, her silver hands moving with a grace that belied the tension in her stance. Her armor hugged her body tight, outlining her full chest and the smooth flare of her hips, but there was no time to linger on that now. Not with the faint tremors shaking the station, the distant booms of explosions echoing through the corridors. Her crimson eyes met his, sharp and steady. "They're close," she said, her voice low but firm. "The core artifact's their target. If they get it, they won't." Elias cut in, his jaw tight. He didn't know how he'd stop them. Not yet. But the grid nexus had chosen him. Its glowing lines had burned into his mind since that first day, and he wasn't about to let it fall into the wrong hands. Kaelyra nodded, a flicker of something like trust in her gaze, and it steadied him, anchoring him in the chaos. The archive door shuddered, a deep groan of metal bending under force. Elias gripped his own rifle, his palms slick with sweat. He'd faced danger before, the black hole, the asteroid field, but this was different. This was the end game, the moment where everything he'd stumbled into since arriving at Nova Crucible would either save them or break them apart. The doors burst open with a deafening crash, and the Seekers stormed in, 6 figures in sleek, black armor, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. Energy weapons crackled in their hands, casting jagged blue light across the chamber. Leading them was a taller figure, its armor etched with Centaura markings, its movements precise and commanding. Elias's gut twisted. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. One of Kaelyra's kind, a traitor turned hunter. "Moo!" Kaelyra shouted, diving behind a containment unit as the first energy blast seared past, scorching the floor where she'd stood. Elias ducked low, rolling to cover beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. Her warmth seeped through his sleeve, a fleeting comfort in the storm. She fired back, her shots precise, forcing the Seekers to scatter. 2 went down, their armor sparking as they hit the ground, but the leader barely flinched, advancing with cold purpose. Elias's eyes darted to the center of the chamber, where the core artifact sat, a massive crystal structure, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light. The grid nexus. He could feel it, a pull deep in his bones like it was calling him. The glowing lines flickered into his vision again, faint but growing stronger, threading through the room like veins of energy. "I need to get to it," he said, his voice rough over the gunfire. Kaelyra glanced at him, her crimson eyes narrowing. "You'll be a target the second you move." "Then cover me," he shot back, meeting her gaze. "I trust you." For a heartbeat, she hesitated, something unreadable flashing across her face. Then she nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Don't make me regret this, human." She shifted, leaning out from cover, and unleashed a barrage of shots that lit up the chamber. The Seekers ducked, their leader barking orders, and Elias seized the chance. He bolted from behind the unit, his boots pounding the floor as energy blasts zipped past, close enough to singe his sleeve. His breath burned in his lungs, but the glowing lines guided him, left, right duck, until he reached the artifact. His hands slammed against its surface, cool and smooth, and a jolt shot through him, sharp and electric. His vision exploded with light, the lines flaring bright and vivid, stretching beyond the chamber, beyond the station, into the void itself. The grid nexus wasn't just a tool. It was alive, a network of ancient power woven into the fabric of space. Elias's mind reeled as it flooded him with data. Ships circling the Academy, Seekers converging on the archives, and something darker, deeper, stirring in the shadows. The Shroud. He could feel it, a cold, hungry presence pressing against the edges of reality, waiting to break through. "Elias." Kaelyra's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. He blinked, snapping back to the chamber. She was pinned near the entrance, trading shots with 3 seekers, her silver form a blur of motion. One blast grazed her arm, sparking against her armor, and she grunted, stumbling back. Rage flared in Elias's chest. He couldn't lose her, not now. "Hold on," he shouted, his hands pressing harder against the crystal. The grid nexus pulsed under his touch, its light intensifying, and he let it in, surrendering to the flood. Pain lanced through his skull, white-hot and searing, but he pushed past it, focusing on the lines. They showed him everything: the station's defenses, the Seeker's ships, the Shroud's growing rift. He could stop it. He had to. The chamber trembled as the artifact's energy surged, a wave of power rippling outward. The containment fields flickered, then flared, their light merging with the grid nexus. Elias's mind stretched thin, his body shaking as he channeled it all. Every system, every connection, into a single command: seal the rift. Stop the Shroud. The station's defense grid came alive, turrets pivoting with unnatural precision, targeting the Seeker's ships outside. One by one, they faltered, their engines dying under the onslaught, drifting helpless in the void. Inside, the Seekers faltered too, their visors flickering as the grid nexus hacked their systems, exposing their neural signatures. The leader spun toward Elias, raising a weapon, a jagged, black device pulsing with dark energy. "You can't stop it," the Centaur snarled, its voice distorted through the helmet. "The Shroud will rise." Elias didn't flinch. The lines showed him the shot before it came, a thin thread of probability arcing toward him. He twisted, the blast searing past his shoulder, and poured everything into the nexus. The crystal flared blindingly bright, a shock wave erupting from its core. The Seekers staggered, their leader dropping to one knee, and the air grew heavy, thick with the sound of a low, unearthly wail. The Shroud, retreating, its rift snapping shut under the Nexus's force. But it wasn't over. The energy surged back into Elias, a tidal wave he couldn't contain. Pain exploded behind his eyes, his knees buckling as his mind burned with the strain. Memories flashed: his father's laugh, his mother's voice, the fields of Terra Verge, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He gasped, clutching the artifact, his vision blurring. He was losing something vital, but he couldn't stop now. "Elias!" Kaelyra's shout broke through again, closer this time. She reached him, her silver hands grabbing his arms, pulling him back from the crystal. The connection snapped, the light fading, and Elias collapsed against her, his breath ragged, his body trembling. The chamber fell silent. The Seekers sprawled unconscious across the floor, their leader's weapon clattering useless beside them. Kaelyra held him up, her grip strong but gentle, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. "You did it," she said, her voice soft, almost awed. "You shut it down." Elias nodded weakly, his head spinning. The grid nexus hummed quietly now, its power spent, the glowing lines gone from his sight. He'd save the Academy, save them all, but at a cost he couldn't yet grasp. His mind felt hollow, pieces missing, but he was alive. They were alive. He straightened, leaning into Kaelyra's support, and turned to face her. Her crimson eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, her silver skin scuffed but radiant, her chest rising and falling with each breath. She didn't let go, her hands lingering on his arms, and something shifted in the air, a quiet, unspoken pull that drew him closer. "You're insane," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "And brilliant." Before he could respond, she stepped in, her arms sliding around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. Her chest pressed against his back, full and warm through her armor, sending a shiver down his spine. Elias exhaled, his hands finding her hips, tracing the smooth curves with a tenderness he hadn't known he had. Her skin, hot, soft, alive, felt like a lifeline in the aftermath of the storm. "Guess I'm full of surprises," he said, his voice low, his fingers brushing the dip of her waist. Kaelyra laughed softly, her breath warm against his neck, and turned him gently to face her. Her eyes locked on his, glowing with something deeper than gratitude, something that made his heart skip. "You're the one thing I can't predict," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of wonder and want. Her hand rested on his chest, her touch light but electric, and Elias felt the last of his strength give way to a different kind of heat. He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her jaw, tasting the faint warmth of her silver skin. She sighed, leaning into him, her body fitting against his like it belonged there. For a moment, they stood in the wreckage of the archive, the hum of the station fading into the background. Elias's hands slid along her hips, feeling the strength and softness beneath her armor, and she pressed tighter, her chest rising against him in a rhythm that matched his own racing pulse. It wasn't the time, not the place, but it didn't matter. They'd survived, and this quiet, burning closeness was their reward. Kaelyra pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes softening. "We need to move," she said, but her hand lingered on his arm, her touch a promise. "The Academy's safe, thanks to you. But this isn't over." Elias nodded, his mind still buzzing, his body still alive with the feel of her. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "But we're in it together now, right?" Her smile widened, faint but real. "Together," she agreed, stepping back but keeping her hand in his. The Seekers were down, the shroud was gone, for now, and as they turned to leave the archive, Elias knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, Kaelyra wasn't just an ally anymore. She was something more, something he'd fight to keep. Elias Korr stood in the command center of Nova Crucible, his hands clasped behind his back, his chest tight with a mix of exhaustion and pride. The wide viewport before him stretched across the room, offering a clear view of the asteroid field beyond. Calm now, its jagged rocks floating silently in the void, free of the Seekers' sleek, predatory ships. The station hummed beneath his feet, alive with the steady rhythm of its systems, a stark contrast to the chaos that had torn through it just hours ago. The shroud was gone, its dark rift sealed by the grid nexus, and the Academy stood safe because of him. Around him, the chamber buzzed with activity. Draken officers barked orders, their scales glinting under the lights, while ethereal technicians floated between consoles, their glowing forms flickering as they repaired the damage. A Centauri commander, tall, stern, and unreadable, approached Elias, his silver face reflecting the glow of the screens. "Korr," he said, his voice deep and clipped. "Your actions saved us. The grid nexus responded to you, something no one predicted. The Council's already calling you a hero." Elias shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of the word. "I just did what I had to," he said, his voice rough from fatigue. His mind still ached. A dull throb with a nexus had burned through him, taking pieces of his past he couldn't quite name. Faces, voices, fragments of Terra Verge slipped away like smoke, leaving gaps he wasn't sure he'd ever fill. But the station was intact, the cadets were alive, and that was enough. The commander tilted his head, studying him. "Modesty doesn't change facts. You're no ordinary human. The Academy owes you a debt." He paused, then added, "And your Centauri companion, she fought well. You make a good team." Elias's gaze drifted across the room, landing on Kaelyra Vonn. She stood near a control panel, her silver form gleaming faintly under the overhead lights, her long black hair spilling over her shoulders. Her armor was scuffed from the battle, but it still clung to her like a second skin, outlining her full chest and the smooth curve of her hips. She was speaking to a technician, her voice low and steady, but her crimson eyes flicked to him for a brief moment, catching his stare. A faint smile tugged at her lips, small, private, and Elias felt a warmth spread through him, chasing away the chill of his losses. "She's more than a companion," he said quietly, almost to himself. The commander grunted, a sound that might have been approval, and turned away, leaving Elias alone with his thoughts. The debriefing dragged on, a blur of questions and reports. Elias answered what he could, how the Nexus had linked to him, how he'd seen the glowing lines, how he'd forced the shroud back, but his mind kept wandering to Kaelyra. She stayed close through it all, her presence a steady anchor, her silver hand brushing his arm once when the questions grew too sharp. By the time the council dismissed them, the station's artificial night had settled in, the lights dimming to a soft amber glow. Elias stepped into the corridor, his boots echoing faintly against the metal floor. Kaelyra fell in beside him, her strides matching his, her warmth a quiet comfort at his side. "They're throwing a ceremony tomorrow," she said, her tone dry but tinged with amusement. "Medals, speeches, the works. You ready to be their golden boy?" He snorted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not really. I'm no good at standing still while people clap." He glanced at her, catching the way her eyes glowed in the low light, the way her lips curved just enough to hint at a tease. "You'll be there, right? Keep me from tripping over my own feet." Kaelyra laughed, a soft, rich sound that made his chest tighten. "If I must," she said, stepping closer, her shoulder brushing his. "Someone's got to make sure you don't ruin it." They walked in silence for a while, heading toward the docking bay where their scout vessel, the same one they'd crashed, sat repaired and waiting. The crew had offered them quarters, but Elias wanted space, a place away from the noise to process everything. Kaelyra hadn't argued, following him without a word, and that alone said more than she ever would allowed. The ship's interior was quiet when they stepped inside, the cockpit bathed in the soft blue glow of its idle systems. Elias dropped into the pilot's chair, leaning back with a sigh, his body heavy with exhaustion. Kaelyra stood by the console, her silver fingers tracing the edge, her gaze distant. "You lost something back there," she said finally, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I saw it in your eyes when a nexus let go." He nodded, staring at the ceiling. "Yeah, memories, I think. Bits of home. It's fuzzy now." He clenched his fists, then let them relax. "But I'd do it again. For us." Kaelyra turned to him, her crimson eyes locking on his, glowing with something deep and unguarded. She crossed the small space between them, her steps slow and deliberate, her hips swaying just enough to pull his breath short. "You're a fool," she murmured, but there was no bite in it, only a warmth that wrapped around him like a promise. She stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her silver skin, her scent, a faint mix of metal and sweetness, filling his senses. Elias reached out, his hands finding her waist, pulling her gently toward him. She didn't resist, stepping between his knees, her body a shimmering vision in the dim light. His fingers brushed her hips, tracing the smooth curve through her armor, and a low hum escaped him as he felt her warmth seep into his palms. "Maybe I am," he said, his voice low and rough, "but I'm your fool now." Kaelyra's breath hitched, her chest rising fast, pushing against the tight armor in a way that made his pulse race. She leaned in, her hands resting on his shoulders, and Elias tilted his head, his lips brushing the curve of her neck. Her skin, hot, soft, alive, sent a shiver through him, and he pressed closer, tasting the faint pulse beneath her silver surface. She sighed, a soft, trembling sound, and slid her arms around him, her chest pressing full and firm against his. His hands moved, one sliding up her back, the other drifting lower, brushing the dip of her waist, then the inside of her thigh. Her body arched into his touch, her breath quickening, and Elias felt the world shrink to just them. The heat of her, the softness of her curves, the way she fit against him like she'd been made for it. "Kaelyra," he whispered against her neck, his lips trailing higher, and she responded, her fingers tightening on his shoulders, pulling him closer. Her chest rose and fell in his arms, her crimson eyes burning bright, alive with a fire he hadn't seen before. She tilted his face up, her lips hovering over his, and for a moment they hung there, caught in the tension, the air thick with want. Then she kissed him, soft at first, then deeper, her warmth flooding through him like a tide. Elias groaned, his hands roaming her hips, her thighs, every touch igniting sparks under his skin. She pressed tighter, her chest heaving against him, her breath mingling with his in a rhythm that drowned out everything else. They pulled back, breathless, their foreheads resting together. Kaelyra's eyes glowed, her silver skin shimmering faintly in the cockpit's light. "You're impossible," she whispered, her voice shaky but warm, her hand lingering on his chest. Elias grinned, his fingers brushing her waist one last time, savoring the feel of her. "Guess you're stuck with me," he said, and she laughed, a sound that lit up the quiet, sealing the bond between them.